share my start with introducing. Welcome everyone. My name is Alexandros. I'm a founding coordinator for the academic project IDSP IO Dissertation Support Project. And today we are privileged to hold an online panel, our medalists panel for our competition. And I'm speaking from London on the 21st of September 2020. As you can see here, we have the logo of our project, IDSP, and the logo of our competition. You can find us on social media with the handle IDSP-IOE on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and with the name IDSP-IOE Dissertation Support Project on LinkedIn, YouTube, Microsoft Teams, and Microsoft Stream. Our hashtag is IDSP20C for this year, for our annual competition this year. So our panel consists of Dr. Richard Freeman, who is the moderator, and our three medalists from our competition, the three first places, or winners, let's say, Dhanisththa, Tianxin, and Marybeth. IDSP20C is a short name for our IDSP competition 2020 for postgraduate dissertations. The panel is moderated by Dr. Richard Freeman, discussing with the medalists about their dissertation research and opportunities for doctoral studies. Let me now briefly introduce the panelists. So Dr. Richard Freeman, Associate Fellow of the British Psychological Society, is the moderator of the panel. He is an Associate Professor of Doctoral Education at the UCL Institute of Education, IOE, Interim Head of the Center for Doctoral Education, CDE, Interim Faculty Graduate Tutor, and Deputy Director of the UBEL SRC funded Doctoral Training Partnership. As you see, many titles that are very important, and we are wishing all the best for all of them. Richard holds a PhD in psychology from the University of Birmingham, as well as a Bachelor of Arts in Social and Political Studies from the University of Cambridge. He is primarily interested in issues related to doctoral education, especially psychological issues that can affect doctoral submissions. So, our warm welcome to Richard. Our first medalist, Dhanishtha Patel, which is also our IPDY20, so the IDSP Postgraduate Dissertation of the Year for 2020. Completed her Master of Science in Psychology of Education at the IOE and her Bachelor in Science in Psychology with Forensic Science. Dhanisththa is currently working as a workplace consultant at CBRE company, dealing with real estate. And she is interested in global education and intersectionality, focusing on how to further develop global education by exploring the lived experiences of adults who had cross-cultural upbringings. Welcome, Dhanisththa. Tianxin, our silver medalist. She's studying her Master of Arts in Applied Linguistics at the IOE and holds a Bachelor of Arts in English. She's interested in language and ideology, currently researching Afrophobia on Chinese social media sites and aiming to unpack race discourse in cyberspace through a combination of quantitative and qualitative methods. Welcome, Tianxin. And finally, Marybeth, our bronze medalist. She's also pursuing an MA in Applied Linguistics at the IOE and holds a Bachelor in Liberal Studies with concentrations in anthropology and history. Marybeth is an English for academic purposes tutor at the University of Essex International College. Her current research interests focus on the effect multilingualism has on the mind and brain, including memory and the attentional control aspects of cognition. Welcome, Marybeth. Finally, administration, gratitude, and wishes. Attendance to this meeting is open to all our team members that can also ask questions in the meeting chat. Our warm gratitude and wishes to our moderator, three medalists and participants. The panel is recorded and can be watched later in our general channel. A reminder that we are accepting proposals from competitors for our weekly data analysis demos. We have already held 2 sessions. We can hold, we're expecting to hold more, happening on Thursdays 8 to 8:20 with 2 available 10-minute slots in the same channel. Finally, wishing a fruitful discussion, I'm turning the floor over to Richard to initiate this promising panel.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Alexandros, for that overview. First of all, I want to congratulate the 3 of you. Giving presentations on your research, and I suppose giving presentations more generally, it's actually a really valuable skill, and it's one that in a way kind of illustrates one of the benefits of doing something like a PhD. So you're getting it having done a master's of what we call nowadays generic or transferable skills. And it's interesting, last week I was attending the Vitae International Conference, and one of the issues that came up quite often was effectively the answer to the question of why do people do a PhD? And in a way, I think the kind of typical answer people would have is the reason you do a PhD is to become an academic. And indeed, if you talk to a lot of PhD supervisors, they will say that's why you do a PhD. But the discussion at the conference last week was recognizing that things have changed. So that certainly might have been true perhaps in the 60s, the 70s, 80s, maybe even the 90s. But nowadays, if you look at the number of people doing PhDs and you look at the number of academic positions, it's just clear by the just looking at the numbers, that the majority of people who do PhDs are not going to become academics. However, that isn't the case of some people win the prize of becoming an academic and the rest are losers by any stretch of the imagination. It really is that academic pathway is one possibility, but there are a wide variety of different possibilities. And there's increasing recognition that doing a doctorate is actually about kind of becoming skilled as a person rather than simply this idea of a straightforward progression through different careers. But I wanted to try to ensure that you got the most out of this time. So rather than trudging through lots of dull slides, I thought it might be helpful to allow you three to ask questions, well, the questions you want to ask, so I can focus on those. Does that make sense?
Yes. You can raise your hand if it makes sense.
Who's going to be first?
We can start in order with Dhanisththa.
Oh, all right. Hi, thank you so much for coming on and talking with us. I guess a question would be, is there another reason anyone else does a PhD rather than becoming an academic? I think that's kind of what my line of thinking was. In order to get to be a professor, to get to be someone who teaches in the university, you have to do a PhD. So I never viewed a PhD as anything else aside from that. Although I do understand it is to be an expert in your field, which can be so useful and so helpful, especially in the world today. So just wondering if there are any other avenues you'd see a PhD being really useful for.
Absolutely. It's interesting, actually, what you said, I think captures it quite nicely. Earlier this century, the government commissioned a report from an eminent academic, Sir Gareth Roberts, which was called Set for Success, and that actually stood for Science, Engineering and Technology. But his report was very much extended to the arts and humanities and the social sciences as well. And Gareth Roberts came up with really quite a profound quotation where he said the product of the PhD research is not the thesis, important though that is to the discipline. No, the product of PhD research is the researcher. And I think it's actually quite a profound shift in perspective. So following what became known as the Roberts Report, the then Labour government, it was when government still had money, actually put quite large sums of money into supporting people who are doing PhDs and indeed people who are postdocs in developing these generic skills. So not the kind of very narrowly focused stuff, but things like public speaking, things like project management. There's actually a whole host of these. In recognition that doing a PhD is actually producing incredibly well-trained people. So, I mean, actually, if you think about it, one of the most famous PhD people who have a PhD would be Angela Merkel. So the German president, and indeed Gordon Brown, the previous British Prime Minister, he also had a PhD. And it's a kind of recognition that people who do PhDs, I mean, at one level, you know, of course, you're clever, you're academically clever to at least some extent if you've done a PhD. But beyond that, these are people who are very highly skilled. So some will go into academia, and there's the various kind of roles. So it's quite nice. You gave the example of teaching. So there's kind of teaching and there's research. But what you're also seeing in the universities is increasing numbers of people with PhDs who aren't actually doing, say, teaching and research. So you'll see them in some of the areas of administration, for instance. So people who want to work within universities, but they don't want to do the teaching or the research. They like the environment. They like working with those people. And indeed, this is the term that's been used to describe them is HEPPros, higher education professionals. So these are people who are doing some of these kind of important roles. So it can be things like the project management side of things. So some of this kind of higher level administration. But outside of that, it's interesting to note, of course, the research that's done outside universities. So that's obvious. You know, you get the kind of institutes. So somewhere that isn't a university would be the Institute for Cancer Research. Not a university, obvious what it does, it's research in, but you have other labs like this that are separate to universities. You particularly find this in some of the countries on the continent, that the best research is actually done in these independent units. Now, thinking just about social sciences, you might think, but do we have things like this here? Well, of course we do. You have things like the Institute for Fiscal Studies. You have these relatively small scale institutions that focus on particular research topics. You have think tanks. So in higher education, one of the ones that you may have heard of is HEPI, the Higher Education Policy Institute. So you know, again, that's the kind of place where you could imagine a social scientist doing work. So you have very much that kind of research activity. Again, if you think about social science, you've got the option of working for marketing companies, so doing commercial research, so using the kinds of skills that are developed in a PhD, but using it in a commercial sense. And then you have a whole enormous range of different things that social scientists with PhDs do. Now, I haven't got the exact figures to hand, but it certainly made me laugh the first time I saw them, that Vitae did a study of people who had got PhDs and were now working outside of effectively the university sector. So beyond the university is the phrase people often use. And they found that most of the people who were working outside the beyond the university had, when they started their PhD, expected to stay within the university sector. But when they asked them how happy they were, they said, yes, I'm very happy. I really enjoy what I do. I find it very rewarding. And they asked them, would you like to go back into the university sector? No. So, it's all too easy, as I think some people might do. It's like, oh, you've been cast out of paradise. But the people who are doing these roles outside universities, they seem very happy with what they're doing. So I think that's actually quite interesting, because there's an element within universities of thinking, but what could possibly be as good as this job? Well, there are actually plenty of things that are just as good. But I think actually one of the telling things is, again, if you look at the studies that Vitae have done of people with PhDs, the levels of kind of satisfaction are literally in the kind of 90s. People very rarely regret having done a PhD. Sure, there's going to be some. Any experience, you have some people who regret it. But it's actually quite striking that, the studies that have been done suggest that people who do PhDs, whatever they end up doing, they find it something that's been valuable.
Thank you.
Tianxin?
Hi. Can you hear me?
Yes.
So I don't have much particular questions about I don't know. It's like I'm thinking of where to go for my next step for my research, and so for doing a PhD in the UK, would it be particularly hard for social science students to get scholarships, like especially for international students, because that's what I'm facing with right now, actually.
Okay,
So,
that's good. Good question.
Yeah, just.
Can I ask your nationality?
I'm from China.
Okay, you are Chinese. So there is obviously a reason I asked that. So the Chinese government does have specific scholarships for its nationals to do PhDs. So what I would say is, in the sciences, pretty much everyone who does a PhD would be funded. And I wouldn't say it's easy to get funding, but there's quite a lot of funding available. When you get into the social sciences, there's much less, and you do find people who self-fund a PhD. And when you get into the arts and humanities, there's even less. It's really kind of funding your own PhD is the norm. So social sciences is kind of in the middle. So there is funding available, but it's very competitive. And I think one of the things that's good to do is to kind of reflect on your own situation. So, as I said, I asked your nationality because I happen to know the Chinese government has particular scholarships available. And, you need to think about, as it were, who you are. Would that give you access to particular scholarships? And indeed, would that restrict your access to some scholarships? So, for instance, you will find some that say you have to be UK, for instance. There are some like that. But it's also worth thinking about your discipline and whether there's particular funding associated with your discipline. So the kind of thing you're thinking about doing, an example would be the Wellcome Trust funds it's actually a very limited range of social science PhDs alongside the more traditional medical ones. So it's essentially, as it were, the social science of medicine in a crude way, but there's a kind of variety of these. The main source for social science PhDs, I would say, is most institutions have some kind of scholarship themselves. So they'll have a limited number that are highly competitive that can be applied for. So, for instance, at UCL, there are kind of general scholarships, but for, say, the IOE, there are actually what are called Bloomsbury College studentships. So this is really, in a way, it's a legacy of when the Institute of Education was a Bloomsbury College. And these are, I now need to try and remember, jointly with the Royal Veterinary College, the London School of Hygiene, Tropical Medicine, SOAS and Birkbeck, I think. And the idea is you have one supervisor at one of those institutions, and the other supervisor has to come from another institution. So the idea is it's promoting interdisciplinary work. So you could imagine it something like it could be education and veterinary science, you know, something like that, that kind of thing. Now, those are actually projects that the supervisors have come up with, and they've been successfully funded. So in that case, you would apply for the studentship, and if you were the person who was chosen for that studentship, you get it. You know, that's so those actually sometimes can be easier to get, because occasionally, to be blunt, you might have a brilliant idea, but it is crossing disciplines, and you know, people kind of think, oh, well, if it was just one of these, I'd be really keen, but when it's both, I'm not so sure. So those can be good. Similarly, you have Research Council funded studentships. So that's I'm the Deputy Director of our UBL. So that stands for, what does UBL stand for? UCL, actually, I'm now trying to remember what it stands for. I always call it UBL. Never think about it. Let's see.
UCL Bloomsbury and East London.
That's it. Thank you. I was just double checking our title. It was actually the Bloomsbury DTC, and it became the UCL Bloomsbury and East London Doctoral Training Partnership. So that's the way our ESRC studentships are distributed. And there are kind of two forms of that. So very similar to those Bloomsbury College studentships, except so these are projects that are devised by a supervisor, but with an external body. So normally an industry body. So it could be, say, something like Transport for London. So you might have a geography project that's being done with Transport for London. And again, you would apply for the particular studentship. Otherwise, there are individual ones that support people to do their own project. So we have, I guess it must be about 30 of those across those institutions. So on one level, 30 is quite a few, but when you think we have something like 200 initial applications, it's highly competitive.
Okay, that's been useful.
But that really is an overview. What anyone who's interested in doctoral study really needs to think quite carefully about what they want to do, and a factor in that could be things like the funding that's available. Doing a PhD is not cheap. Oh, and the other thing that's to notice, there's been a very recent by the UK research councils in that they are now allowing international students to apply for a maximum of 30% of the funded places. Now, they've only just announced this, and I can tell you all of the doctoral training partnerships are working out how they're going to manage that. So it's genuinely an open question of what the different doctoral training partnerships will do to facilitate that, because one of the things that you will notice is that the fees that are charged for either home students or overseas students are quite dramatically different. I mean, basically, a home student would pay £7,000 in fees, an overseas student £17,000. So it's quite a bit more expensive. Part of the reason for that is the home students are subsidised by the UK government. So there's what's called QR funding, which is, you may have heard of the REF. One of the things you get is this QR funding that supports research activities, and part of that is, you know, effectively subsidising those PhD fees.
Okay, thank you.
Marybeth? Marybeth, your microphone.
Sorry, I always forget to do that. Sorry, so I do have a few questions. And one of them was about PhDs being really multidisciplinary. And my project that I'm considering, has a lot to do with cognitive psychology and linguistics together. And so I guess my question is, when you are proposing a project that involves a discipline that you don't have a lot of training in, how would you go about, I guess, marketing yourself to a potential supervisor when you don't have any formal coursework in that field?
Okay, that's a good question. I guess my approach would be to, it's worth saying nowadays, it's considered best practice to have 2 supervisors. So you have a principal and subsidiary supervisor. So for instance, at UCL, that's compulsory, or at least it should be compulsory. It's not 100% of the time, but it should be the case. You have a principal supervisor and a subsidiary. And I think really for me, it would be about approaching one supervisor to effectively get them on board, and then discussing with them who would be a suitable additional supervisor. Now, in the simplest case, that first person you approach, I think, would be your principal supervisor, and the person from the field you're not so familiar with would be the subsidiary one. What you might want to do is actually try to identify academics who are doing that already. So you'll have, say, somebody who might be a psychologist, but they're already working with somebody kind of linguistics. So, you could find somebody who's in that position, write to probably the psychologist and say that you've read their work and you really, you found it very interesting, really like the ideas, that kind of thing, and wondered if they'd be interested in being a supervisory team. And what's quite nice about that kind of approach is it's quite flattering. It's, people are always open to flattery, but it's quite nice in that someone might say, oh, yes, I've worked with that person before, but the kind of thing you're saying, not you've been stupid or anything, but no, I don't think they're quite the right person, but actually their colleague, that could be very interesting. And you can imagine them either saying, oh, why don't you write to them saying I've suggested them, or I will write to them, and, sort of take it from there. So I think it is possible. It's just a case of, I think with some of these things where people sometimes get caught out is they think that they'll be able to sort these things very quickly. And the problem all too often is these things take time. I mean, for instance, right now, if you email academics right now, you will not get a rapid response because everyone is trying not to panic, preparing for the new term that starts, just over a week's time, and trying to deal with all the challenges that COVID brings. So somebody wanting to talk about a research project, there's a chance, it might take at least a week to even get a kind of acknowledgement because things are just so hectic. You might be lucky and get a response quickly, but I think it's important because sometimes people forget this. Some academic staff, probably most of them, are incredibly busy. And it's one of the reasons why when you write to somebody who's an academic, it's worth spending some time thinking about it and trying to make sure that your email is as short as possible, but as informative as possible and actually tailored to that person. So I've received emails from people who've said, they'd really like to do a PhD with me because they're really impressed with my work and they hope they can work in my lab on the genetics of something or other. Right, I'm a psychologist, I don't have a lab and I don't do genetics. And, they've clearly just written to hundreds of academics and, they've just effectively kind of scraped their details and they haven't looked at all. And it's actually really, really annoying because one level it wastes, I don't know, a minute, but there's only 60 minutes in a day and, we're just so busy. And of course, it's almost the more eminent you are, the more likely you're going to get emails. So, that's a problem. And it's funny, occasionally I'll see people who say, oh, every academic, if they get this kind of email, they should send a long detailed reply. And you just think, but, I don't have enough time to do my job as it is. I genuinely couldn't afford the time to send a long detailed reply to everyone. because you just don't have the time. You genuinely don't have the time. Okay, you had other questions.
Thank you. Yeah, so my next question was also kind of about marketing yourself, but if you had to pick maybe the top 3 skills that you could use to market your PhD to an employer outside of academia, which would you choose?
Oh, top 3 skills. Well, organization, that kind of self-organization, communication in general, and then, well, written communication. I think, I mean, there's the kind of, I mean, there's a whole list of things that you could have. So the Vito produced what they called their researcher development framework. It has 4 domains, 12 subdomains, and 63 descriptors. The idea is there's kind of 63 different aspects that a researcher might develop. But I think those 3 are probably 3 of the biggest. Actually, maybe I'd have to think a bit carefully. Kind of networking, that ability to work with others, I think is something else you should develop as part of a PhD.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
So if anyone has a duty to go, you can go. Is it, Dhanisththa, do you have to go?
A vote, sorry?
Do you have to go? Do you have a meeting?
Oh, no, sorry, I was just going to ask another question if possible.
Yeah, go ahead.
So, I mean, I'm sure you'd know more than I do, but we're seeing education and the landscape of education change, not just in the UK, but all over the world globally. And I'm hearing a lot of talk how education is going to be changing, especially in primary and secondary schools. Then just a little bit on universities, especially for undergraduates. And then masters, I've seen the way that it's adapted in like during summer as well, because it's a 1-year course. However, I've not actually heard much about how a PhD is going to change and the landscape of it. Not only, I mean, I've heard about the research, so like people allowing more for general research to take place online, as well as the ethics that goes behind it. But I've not actually heard about the people coming in and knowing, just doing a little bit of research on Gen Z and them coming into now the workplace, but also wanting to do the PhDs. They're a huge different cohort, and most of them are international, if not global themselves. Do you see the landscapes of how PhDs themselves will be taking this course different to what it is now?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, the Institute of Education is quite unusual for its doctoral cohort. So if you think about, say, in the sciences, I think it's far more usual for people to do a PhD straight after undergraduate. They might do kind of undergraduate, master's, PhD. There's that kind of straight through model. Education's different in that what you tend to find is it's not unusual for people to kind of be working in education, say as a teacher, and they realize there's kind of an issue, there's something they want to investigate. And sometimes, I mean, that's kind of interesting that I've been talking about the PhD, but of course at the Institute of Education, we have what's called an EdD. So this is a professional doctorate in education. So this is for people who are kind of mid-career professionals working in education. And the doctorate, they have taught classes, which are assessed. They still do a thesis, but it's much shorter than, you know, the kind of 100,000 maximum. It's, you know, just under half of that typically. So it's a different kind of thesis. And their focus is more on that kind of professional practice. And of course, it's worth mentioning too, you have the other professional doctorates. So for instance, at the Institute, we have the doctorate in educational psychology. In the psychology and language studies department of UCL, we also have clinical psychology doctorates. So this is people who are going to be practitioners, but want to have those high level skills to be able to do that job. In a way, it's kind of goes back to where we started, that there are these careers that require a doctorate. Now, in this case, if you want to be an educational psychologist, I couldn't go and be an educational psychologist because I don't have a doctorate in educational psychology. I just have a PhD in psychology. So you have these kind of very specific roles that require doctoral level study. And then the kind of more generic ones. So I think what you are going to see is that, you know, actually it's almost where the institute is. So you have, you know, our kind of age distribution is really quite flat. So you've got people in their 20s, their 30s, their 40s, their 50s, and even some older than that, who are doing doctorates. And I think you are going to see increasingly people returning to study, and where currently that tends to be more masters. I think in the future you will get people who will be returning to study, but actually at doctoral level. I think you're going to get more. It's interesting. We launched an online PhD in October 2014, and when we did it, that was really quite unusual, and particularly ours was completely online. But that's something that I think people have become more interested in. And again, I think partly it's if you're someone who's a bit older, you don't necessarily want to relocate your family for at least 3 years to somewhere just so you can go to a particular university. So if you can fit it in around things like your kind of family responsibilities, around things like employment, you know, that's actually going to make a lot of sense. So in kind of related to that, I think the part-time doctorate is going to become more typical. I mean, when I did my PhD in a psychology department, there were effectively kind of 1 or 2 people who were doing part-time PhDs, and we thought that was very strange at the time. I mean, as a, you know, someone in their early 20s knowing very little, that seemed very strange to me. But I think things like that is, you know, they're going to be far more common.
So it seems that we should conclude at this point, because as Richard said, the time is passing very quickly, and we have also several other duties to follow.
Can I give some final advice?
Yes, of course, you can.
One of the things that I think is important to do is read instructions carefully. So it's things like if you're applying for funding, read the instructions very carefully. You know, watch out for them changing at the last minute. Generally, it tends to be the case with these schemes. They're pretty similar year by year, but I know with our DTP one, there will be changes. I don't know what they are yet. We haven't agreed them, but you need to kind of pay account of that. Similarly, when you're writing things like a research proposal, so normally if you're going to get funded, if it's one of these where you're trying to get your idea funded, you'll need to write a research proposal. You must follow the instructions. You know, if you're told a maximum of 2 pages, for instance, and you put in 4 pages, it won't get read because it's not fair on the other people who have followed the instructions. Do make sure that you follow the instructions. So I suppose the sort of simple thing is you tend to get, when you're doing a proposal, it's kind of rationale, research questions, literature review, perhaps theoretical framework, but methodology, ethics, timeline. These are the kinds of things you expect to see. If you're asked to provide a timeline and you don't provide a timeline, odds are it goes in the bin. You know, it could literally not get read because you haven't followed the instructions. And that sounds petty, but remember what I said, 200 applications. And we don't have the time. You don't have the time to kind of go, oh, they haven't done this right. We should drop them an email and ask them to supply this. It has to go in the bin. You just don't have the luxury of that kind of extra time. And similarly, it's really, really important that you get the writing to a high standard, and in particular, no kind of silly mistakes. It's astonishing sometimes that you read a document and it hasn't been proofread. This does not create a good impression, and particularly if it makes it hard to write. One of the things I think is really important to recognise in that a lot of these schemes, you might be applying, as it were, for psychology, but your application will be read, as it were, by social scientists. So you'll have people who say sociologists, You know, it could be human geographers. If your application can only be understood by a psychologist, that panel is going to say, you know, shrug their shoulders. You know, I'm a sociologist, as it were. What do I know about this? So you want to try and make the language as clear as possible to the intelligent reader. I mean, obviously this can vary. You might have a studentships that are just for the psychology department, and then you're writing for, you know, the kind of the general psychologist. You know, you'd not want it to be really, really narrow. It should be something that's understandable by non-experts. So the kind of thing I think is quite useful is getting somebody you know to read it, because one of the problems you'll discover is if you write any document that you're really, you know, you're working on words here and there. Sometimes it's, I need to lose 7 words, and you spend half an hour to get rid of 7 words to fit it on the page or whatever. It is at that point almost impossible to proofread it yourself, because you just won't see the mistakes. Give it to somebody else and they typically will be able to spot your mistakes. You know, they'll say, oh, did you mean to write that? Or I don't understand this sentence at all. And you suddenly realize you've ended up writing a 6-line sentence that kind of makes sense to you until somebody says, that's a really long sentence. And you kind of take a step back and go, yeah, I need to rewrite that. So I think that it sounds petty, but things like that can make a really big difference.
So Richard, I also have a question now. Do you have the number of how many applicants there were last for doctoral studies and how many were accepted? So it happens twice per year?
No, it's a bit more complicated than that. So with the Doctoral Training Partnership, we have once a year, we have a scheme where people can apply. What I would say, though, is it's very, very difficult to talk about what percentage are successful, because, for instance, with our Doctoral Training Partnership, some of the institutions, they will not let you enter the first round unless you've been accepted. Because it is, you know, if you, you know, as it is, we have, I think it is about 200 in the first round, and you have to kind of try and get the numbers lower. You know, when you're looking at giving, in that particular scheme, 30 funded places, you know, it'd be kind of silly to have a final meeting where you're considering 200 applications. So what we do is people have to do a shortened version of the application form, so we can pick the ones that seem most likely, and then they can go through to the second round. But I think in a way it's that figure of, you know, you're starting with 200 and you end up with 30. I think that gives you the kind of idea. So I would consider those 200 all to be people who kind of properly want to do a PhD. It's not kind of, oh, well, that would be an option. These are people who want to do a PhD. So something like 1 in 7.
This is for funded places?
Yeah.
If someone wants to do it without funding?
It varies, actually, because to be blunt, at some institutions, if you said I'm prepared to fund myself, I suspect it's something like 100%.
Oh, okay.
At somewhere like the Institute, what it actually tends to be more down to is capacity. So the research intensive universities will normally say there's a maximum number of people you can supervise, which makes sense. So if you don't have any space, then you can have kind of the best person, you know, you think this is an amazing person, but I don't have any space. And of course, if all your PhD students just by chance happen to be at the early stages, you know, you might say, well, could you come back in 2 years' time? And I might have a space then. So again, I think it's actually very difficult to say. I think if you were determined to do a PhD and you had the money, then you would be able to do it somewhere. But, you know, I think just because you really like the idea of doing a PhD and you can afford it, I don't think that necessarily means you should do a PhD. And certainly the vast majority of PhDs, but this is, I think this is a kind of bias from the science funding. It tends to be at the Russell Group universities. So certainly there are very, very good institutions in the social sciences that aren't Russell Group universities. but you find the bulk of the PhD students in those Russell Group universities.
At the IOE, how many? What is the ratio between funded and unfunded doctoral?
It's difficult to say because there's the funding that I've described, but then there's things like the national funding. So there's actually the funding comes from a variety of different sources, and you can have people who say have some of their fees. Well, it could be their fees are paid for, but they're having to support themselves. People who do, for instance, doctorates in education, typically those are actually funded by their employer. Not always, but typically they're funded by the employer. So it's a good question, but it's actually surprisingly difficult to give a kind of definitive answer.
And finally, is there an advantage of one that is graduating a master's at the IOE when being considered for PhD study?
At the IOE?
Yes. Yes.
Not officially. I think it.
Is there any support, extra support, for example, by the IOE to invite the graduates to doctoral studies?
Yeah, what we have done is, you know, things like our doctoral summer conference. We try to make that accessible to master's students. So last year, it was in June, because of COVID, things got a bit hectic. So I'm not sure the invitations actually made it as far as the master's students. But certainly when it was face-to-face, we used to invite master's students to attend. Last year, I think it was last year, we did a session for IOE students explaining in, you know, far greater detail than I have today about some of the issues about doing the different kinds of doctorates and what's involved in them. So I think that helps IOE students. And I think, to be honest, one of the things that really does help is you tend to know the staff. And I think if you do a PhD, there's also that you've got a sense of the place and the kind of ethos, because one of the reasons, you know, I very much like working at the Institute. And I suppose in a way there's, well, probably three reasons. Being cynical, this was the third reason I thought of, it's #1 in the world. So it's kind of nice. I mean, it's a nonsense, those rankings, but it's still quite nice to be the #1 institution in the world. So it's nice to be associated with that prestige. But actually, the real top one for me would be the people. So I think it's a really good group of people. Not perfect, you won't find that in the real world, but you have a community of scholars who I think is motivated by a concern to try and make the world, particularly via education, a better place. I think they're very committed to their students. You know, the complaints are often, you know, oh, we could do more for the student type complaints. And then, of course, and this is where COVID's such a shame, just that simple sense of place. So being based in Bloomsbury, you know, you're next to, well, LSE's just down the road. You've got SOAS is right next to us, Birkbeck just the other side of SOAS, London School of Hygiene, Tropical Medicine, Senate House, the British Museum, the British Library. You know, it's just such an incredible place to be, and you've got that concentration of other academics. You've got the history of Bloomsbury, and I think something like that, you know, it's really quite a privilege to be able to work in that kind of environment. And I do think of some universities that, let's just say, they've embraced neoliberalism. I don't think UCL is a kind of Marxist institution by any stretch of the imagination, but I think it does have a sense of going beyond sort of pounds and pence, and I think it's an institution that likes to try to be guided by values in a way that is perhaps not as usual as it used to be.
And also there are several training courses for those that started PhD, I think.
Oh, we have, I think you could easily argue it's the best in the country, because we have the IOE Research Training Programme, we have UCL Central Programme, and then we have the Bloomsbury Postgraduate Skills Network, which was set up by UCL, must be about 20 years ago now, where institutions like the Bloomsbury institutions I've mentioned, plus King's, plus LSE, share some of that generic skills training. So you have access to those. And then, of course, just being in London, you kind of end up going to, say, a seminar at LSE because it's of relevance to your research. And being able, it is this ridiculous thing about having world-class universities as your immediate neighbours. It's not something you can say of many institutions. I mean, funnily enough, you think of places, other prestigious places in Britain, Oxford and Cambridge. Well, Oxford has Oxford Brookes. It's actually a very good university, but it doesn't have UCL next to it. It doesn't have a bus trip away or a short ride on the tube away. They have that kind of isolation. So, I think you really get something special in London, plus all the delights of London, of course, when we're allowed to enjoy them again.
Thank you very much.
I'm sorry, could I ask a quick question? So, given the application, not just for a PhD, but just in general research, I know it's important about the methodology and the way you present the work itself, but the topic of the research itself, do you feel there is a bit of bias when it comes into the funding for it or it actually being conducted within universities?
Not really. I mean, the location of the research shouldn't matter. So if you think, the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, if you think about the typical PhD that would be funded by the ESRC, it would normally involve going abroad somewhere to collect the data. So, it would be remote data collection. What does matter is, it's the quality of the data. For me, that's what I'd be thinking about when you're thinking about from an academic context. It's not having a chat to some people the way that, say, that's how I would describe what a journalist does. So you're collecting your data within a theoretical framework. You're following an interview protocol. You've had ethical approval. Those are the kind of bits that, and you're doing it in the context of the other research that's being done. That's what makes research academic, not its location.
The only reason I ask this is, for example, if we talk like Tianxin's work is incredible about Afrophobia in China. But if we were to talk about the whitewashing of curriculums, and if we were to look at higher education, that's the only reason why I ask. And it's good to know that that doesn't play as much of an impact as well. So thank you.
So it seems we can conclude here. So thank you all very much for this session. It was, I think, very informative and insightful. So Richard shared with us some insights about how the doctoral process works, how we can approach it. And we also had the questions from our medalists. And I think they're all interested in a PhD study, but they are trying to reorientate themselves, whether it will be find a supervisor, find the institution. Does any one of you have already found a supervisor? Dhanisththa?
I love my professor at UCL at IRE, the one I did my master's dissertation with, and we asked him to be a PhD supervisor, but I've decided to take a couple of years to get experience, outside experience, just so I can set myself up for knowing exactly what I want to do, because I still feel like I'm very young. So that's still on the back burner, but I know for a fact I want him to be my supervisor.
Tianxin? You're still trying to find the supervisor. Your microphone?
Yeah, because I'm still actually trying to narrow down my research scope because I find that the topics that I'm interested in can be approached in different aspects. For example, from digital communication and also digital anthropology and also maybe sociolinguistics. So I'm still trying to work out which one is the subject and the discipline that best fits my current topics, and then I can work on to find the right supervisor.
And Marybeth? Marybeth, can you hear?
So I'm writing a proposal right now. Sort of in the middle of it, and hopefully we'll be contacting I have a few supervisors in mind that I'll be emailing it to. But as you mentioned, maybe the timing right now isn't the best, so I might wait a few weeks just so it's not quite as overwhelming. But I have a few people in mind, yeah. So I'm just finalizing my proposal and I guess picking the best or most optimal time to send it around.
All the very best to all of you.
Yes, good luck.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And
Thank you.
we can talk in another session. Also, we are open, as we heard, we have a weekly session. You can present further your work, what you are doing, especially your data analysis, if you are working on data analysis. We are grateful to all of you. Have a nice day.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.